We continue with our discussion on advanced financial modeling, and in this particular section, we're going to talk about a few important features about financial models. Uh, these would typically be the closing ends of Unit 1, and post that, we'll probably look at a few examples in terms of how good models behave or bad models behave, and we'll probably learn most of what theoretical concepts we have seen in Unit 1 along some of the examples that we take in further subsequent units that we're going to study, right? So in this, we are going to kind of understand that it's always a good idea when you are building a financial model to identify what are your key inputs and variables. So basically, you need to define the key values that we will need in any value in any model to be able to arrive at the output. And we've already seen examples of this. For example, in doing valuation, we need to identify what are the key inputs and assumptions in our model. Now, a good idea is that you mention what are the key inputs and assumptions. You can show them in a different color as well, so as to ensure that everyone understands what is an input and what is the data that is given, what is that assumption that you're making, and where is the calculation happening, right? So you can choose different color codes for inputs slash assumptions, and you can choose a different color code for calculations, which could stay wherever your calculations are, and these could be intermediate calculations. And then you could have another color code for your end output that comes out, right? So that's the idea. Similarly, just like we saw in the last slide, you have to identify and put in what is the deliverable, what is the output of the model. The model output has to be clearly defined so that we're clear about what can we expect and where can we find it. So if you're doing a valuation exercise, people know that the output is expected to be a valuation, and so there is a valuation sheet where people can go and look at it. If you're looking at a loan repayment exercise, people know that the output would be a repayment schedule, so they can look at a schedule sheet, or wherever repayment schedule comes, they can look at that, right? Also, it's always good to probably mention it in another color, so you know that you've highlighted it. So the different color thing comes here as well. In terms of building a good financial model, it kind of aids the overall understanding on how a deliverable is defined, right? So inputs, deliverables, and most importantly, there are two more angles to what you're doing in a financial model. A financial model has many inputs, remember, and they may start affecting the overall flow. You have input 1 all the way up to, let's say, input n could be 20. All these are interacting to give you a variety of calculations. And some of these will become clearer when we start using live models. And we will come back to all these aspects and understand how do we look at stress testing. But remember that all these inputs are creating calculations, and you have to understand that one input should not affect any other functionality anywhere. So if you end up using a particular model and you change one input here or there, and it starts affecting the functionality in other areas, that is what stress testing should find out. When I change one input, it should only change the calculations that are directly being affected by it. It shouldn't change other calculations, right? So the model has to be stress tested, saying that all the parts are working in cohesion, all the parts are moving towards identifying what the final goal is, and all the linkages are working correctly. There is no error that we are finding, and there is a clear reliability that is there. So it's important to look at some of those areas and understand where it is coming from. And finally, a financial model is incomplete without some documentation about how the model flow moves. Documentation can be done in three ways. You can use a name manager. We have seen in earlier sections, earlier courses, how to define a name manager. So if sales is 100 and operating profit is 20, then operating profit margin can be defined as 20 by 100, I can give names to these two. I can put this as OP and I can put this as sales. So instead of doing the cell reference, which might be, let's say, C6 divided by C5, just argument sake, I'm taking these two cells, I can do operating profit divided by sales if I can create this, right? So I can use a name manager. I can use in cell comments. So when I take an assumption, I can define the comments for any assumption, right? And it can be within that cell. So I can right click a cell and insert a comment, and that comment will basically tell me what is my thought process behind coming to that assumption, right? And I can use a completely separate column or sheet, entire sheet, for the key assumptions and model flow. So I can just create another sheet altogether which says these are all the assumptions. If there are a lot of assumptions, then probably using in cell comments may not be a great idea. It might make sense to create an entire sheet for the key assumptions and model flow, right? So in valuations, this might be useful, right? But this documentation within the Excel file is fairly important. And at times you could also use this documentation outside the Excel file in the form of another sheet or a document that is available, right? So let's actually look at a few examples and that'll help us understand this better. Let's take a simple example. We're trying to kind of calculate the EMI or equated monthly installment, and we have been given a loan amount that is 40 lakhs years, 20-year loan, and 9% is the annual interest rate. Note how we have defined the units for all these three. Note how we have clearly put in the numbers with a certain kind of decimal points. Now we want to find out EMI. EMI is going to be in INR. And how do I calculate this EMI? There's a function called PMT, right? And what do I put in PMT? We can put the rate. Rate is going to be, remember EMI is monthly, so I'm going to put the monthly rate. Number of years into 12 months. Present value minus the loan amount, right? And future value is going to be 0. So I can click on OK and we get the EMI as 35,989. Now, depending on the case, we might want to zero down on what is the input and what is the data that is given to us. Maybe there is a variable in this equation, right? And let's say the variable is interest rate. I change the interest rates as a variable. So I've defined this as a variable. I can change the interest rate as a variable. The other two I can highlight as probably these are inputs. So these are given to me, that someone is taking a loan amount for 20 years and that loan amount is 40 lakhs. What would be the EMI on various interest rates? And interest rate 8.5%, interest rate 9.5%, interest rate 11%. What is going to be the EMI? So the variable here in this model, this is a small model that we've built. The variable here is the interest rate. The fixed data or the inputs that are given to us are the loan amount and the tenure. And this is the output. We can define the output in a different cell and say this is the entire output that we are looking at. We are calculating the output, which is here. We're looking at the variable, which is this rate that is there. And we have been given some fixed data, which is the input that we have created, right? That's the example of using clearly defined variables, inputs and outputs, right? Variable is something that will change, and that's why we have defined the interest rate as the variable here. We can also do the same calculation. Maybe the example states, okay, for how long can a loan be afforded if interest rate is 9%, that's given, and I want to kind of solve for this now, right? And this can change. And let's say we want to look at what happens to the EMI if the tenure becomes 18 years, if the tenure goes to 30 years, what happens to the EMI, right? So those things we can play around with by changing what is the variable, what are the inputs, what are the given data points, and what is the output. Now look at documentation. How do we do the documentation around this? So we look at this data set and we look at maybe this. So one of the ways of documenting is just putting a name manager. So instead of this equation which someone is reading, it doesn't give a very clear sense of what's happening, right? So we can go to this and define a name which is saying the loan amount. We can look at this as the loan term, and we can look at this as the annual rate, right? And I can now replace all these three here. So we have not defined, we have to put enter there, annual rate, and we can now go ahead and change these formula points, right? So let's do that. Here, instead of D7, which is the rate, I'm going to put annual rate, right? And it should work the same way, no changes. In the case of tenure, I can put the loan term, remember, right? That was what we had said. Loan term, was that the loan term? Did we finalize? We didn't actually, right? So we didn't press enter here. So loan term, and that's enter, so that's loan term. So I can change D6 to loan term and nothing changes. And D5 is the loan amount, right? So I can look at the loan amount and I can put this as the loan amount, right? So that naming could be done, which just makes this a simpler formula to read for someone, right? Documentation. Another round of documentation could be you could just right click and insert a comment. When you right click and insert a comment, this will open a box. That box would appear like this, right? So you can write initial amount of loan taken, right? Or the principal, whatever you want to write. You can do that, and that's your documentation in terms of inserting a comment. You can go here and it shows you the initial amount of loan taken. That's how it's going to work essentially. And similarly, you could just have another column altogether that is put in, which says initial amount of loan. It says tenure, it says interest rates assumed, and how were they assumed, basically. So you can put a column or a different sheet that does this, right? Look at another sheet. We had seen this user friendliness. If we want to find out the EBITDA margin, I can introduce a row here and find out the EBITDA margin, which is 35,666 divided by the operating revenues, right? And that should come in terms of percentage points, which we get here, right? Now, that's the formula, and if you give this to someone, they will have to read the formula. So it might be a good idea when you're building a model that some of the complicated formula, at least you try and arrive at using nomenclatures or naming conventions. It could be a good idea to select this, put this as OP or operating profit, right? OPPR is what I am kind of going to put this in. So EBITDA is OP underscore PR underscore PR, and we kind of do this. And similarly, we will select this and we can take OP underscore revenue, right? So we press an enter and we get this, right? Now, EBITDA margin is just OP underscore PR divided by OP underscore revenue, and it gives me the same formula. It just makes it more readable, right? I can basically look at these and it just makes things more readable when we are looking at something around this. So using name managers, using in cell comments or separate columns for comments, it's a good idea. In our example, we can also put in comments here. Essentially, in the last column, we can just put a separate column and say, where are these coming from? So what are the operating revenues, total operating revenues, sum of revenue from ops and other operating revenue. And we can also put an explanation here. Other income is excluded. in our calculation. When we did the EBITDA calculation or the calculation of EBITDA margin, we did not take total revenue, we only took total operating revenues, right? That's basically the power of documentation or the need of documentation when we are building a financial model. It is very important for us to look at building these documentations into the model so that they are easier for everyone to comprehend and understand whenever people are approaching a valuation exercise, right? So that's broadly it in this particular video. A couple of questions as we end this. Why is documentation in a model necessary? And what are the various ways you can do documentation in a financial model? Thank you.